Hello and welcome to The View from 22. I'm Kate Andrews, the Spectator's economics editor, and I'm joined by Marian Tupy, who is the editor at humanprogress.org, a senior fellow at the Cato Institute, and author of Superabundance. Marian, thanks for joining me on The View from 22. The crux of your argument is that we will never run out of resources. That is a counterintuitive argument. Why are you so convinced by it?
Well, partly because we have never run out of anything. And partly because we already know how to increase the supply of resources to keep up with population and consumption growth. We know how to increase efficiencies so that we use less resources in order to achieve certain outcome. We know that we can have substitution, meaning that instead of, for example, killing whales in order to get their fat for oil lamps, we now use electricity. So we can increase efficiency. We can substitute. We can reuse. So right now, all that zinc and all that copper is temporarily assigned to do certain functions, but in the future we can still reuse them to do something else. After all, the same amount of resources that were always on the planet are still here. They haven't disappeared. Dematerialization is going on, which means that your iPhone is also a radio, a TV, a phone, a notebook, etc., etc. So we are using less resources that way. And should at some point in the future come a moment when we really don't have resources, then we can create our own resources. All you need to create new elements is fusion reactors and hydrogen. So there's an infinite number of possibilities how we can increase our resource supply and therefore continue to feed humanity.
The pandemic sent out mixed messages on this, as did Russia's war against Ukraine, because on the one hand, we did have shortages. We have had shortages around all kinds of things, including medical supplies during COVID, certainly around petrol and oil since Russia decided to invade Ukraine. On the flip side of that, most people, certainly in the UK, in the US where you live, they won't have felt those limitations because people quickly compensated. Other supply chains got online. Some will say that is a reason that we need to home grow everything. That is a reason we actually need to throw away these supply chains and make sure everything is available in our country. Others say, no, this is capitalism at work. This is an incredible story. I suspect you fall into the latter camp. But is there some merit in that first camp of saying, look, these things can break down. We have to be prepared?
Well, the key point of the book and of my work is that there is nothing inherent on the planet to prevent us from having more resources, from creating more resources. In fact, what we found was that in spite of us using a lot of resources to power the Industrial Revolution over the last 200 years, resources today are much cheaper than what they were for our ancestors. So there's nothing inherent on the planet preventing us from doing that. But of course, politics can interfere. Wars can interfere. They can make resources artificially scarcer because we bomb factories or we put barriers to trade, we blockade each other and what have you. And that's exactly what happened when COVID created an artificial shortage, or rather government response to COVID has created artificial shortages. And then, of course, the war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, has reminded us of the importance of peace. If you want to have plenty, it's best if the world is at peace. Now, I think that globalization will undergo certain adjustments. People will most likely be interested in, for example, having more pharmaceutical companies producing drugs at home. There will be some adjustments in terms of supply chains with regard to national defense, the armaments industry, and so on. But I do caution people from assuming that autarky is possible. I don't think autarky is possible for Britain, and I don't think autarky is possible for the United States. We only have 300 million people.
Only.
Yes.
Sounds like a lot from the UK's perspective.
but when you think about the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of different products that American people like to buy, that need to be sourced from the rest of the world, the avocados from Mexico, the blueberries and grapes from Chile, whiskey from Scotland. We simply don't have enough people to be able to create those products at home in the United States and to the same quality. So trade will have to continue. And trade is also a fabulous way of ensuring that when you do have a domestically generated shortage, you can respond to that shortage by importing something from abroad. And a perfect example of that was the astonishing failure of providing infant formula in the United States. For whatever reasons, some of them quite complicated technical reasons, we only ended up with 2 companies in the United States creating infant formula. And both of those, for some reason, were unable to supply the market. So at that point, we had to drop our protectionist policies against Europe and import infant formula from Europe. Otherwise, we would still have shortages. In some ways, these global links increase fragility, but in many ways, they actually create an anti-fragile economy. Very much depends on time and place.
There's so many who would claim that the world is now overpopulated, that we have far too many people, that they'd like to see a reduction in the number of people who are currently on the planet. But one of the graphs, I was looking through your many graphs that you provide on human progress. It's a very optimistic tale that's told there. And one I was looking at was food supply. I mean, it is incredible, actually. You would think, again, it's counterintuitive, right? This idea that the more people you get, the greater the food supply becomes. A lot of people make a reasonable assumption that the graph would be going the other way, but it's not. Are there any areas where we do see a tightness, though, as we have more people, as we get wealthier and can buy more things? Do we see trade-offs elsewhere?
Well, you got me on this question. Sometimes, let's say, for example, that you enjoy ocean front property, and if you have a lot of people,
who doesn't?
Yes, and if you have a lot of people, and there is only so much ocean front property to go around, so prices may increase. With growth in population, obviously, you're going to have increases in the price of housing in most desirable areas. Now, we can compensate for that. Mm-hmm. In an ideal world, for example, you can increase beach property by, for example, what they did in Dubai. They've created miles and miles of new beachfront properties on the Palm Island and so forth. So it's not true that all of these things are restricted. You can actually increase those kind of shortages, just as you can increase housing. Mm-hmm. It is true that housing has increased in price in some of the very desirable areas, but if we didn't have NIMBYism, if we didn't have government overregulation, we would probably be able to increase housing supply and therefore decrease the prices of housing. So I think that within a free market economy, the market adjusts to population increases. Sometimes population increase can create a temporary problem, but so long as you have a free market, these things do get sorted out. But if you do have a population increase and the market is not allowed to perform its magic, the invisible hand is not allowed to increase the supply, for example, because of government regulations, then these sort of artificial shortages can continue for a long time to come.
Housing is a great example. It brings me on to the next question I wanted to ask you, which is about willingness to build more, willingness to create more. Here in the UK, there is a housing crisis. The housing market acts less like a market, more like a cartel. It is very difficult for young people these days without the bank of mom and dad to even think of a time where they might get on the housing ladder, especially in areas like London in the southeast, where a lot of the jobs are, but they're simply not able to live. But based on what you're saying here, this isn't an issue of scarcity because the world and its laws dictate there has to be scarcity. It's a choice being made by government.
Yes, I mean, you do have a lot of, I believe you call it brownfields here in the United Kingdom, where you could build more houses.
We have a lot of really awful greenbelt land too. I mean, wasteland essentially that gets dubbed as greenbelt, and then it's very, very hard to claw it back.
Yes, and a lot of times governments will respond to or are responding to special interest groups, pensioners, for example, who or property owners who don't like to see new buildings being built in their areas. And those people are likely to vote in greater numbers than young people without housing. So politicians respond to those kinds of pressures. But this is a problem across the world, and we know it's a government-created shortage. Only a short while ago, a young man from Australia was complaining to me that the house prices in Australia are very, very high and unaffordable for the young. But Australia is a continent-sized country, and it's almost totally empty. So there is absolutely no reason not to have housing there, but the government stands in the way. So the bottom line is that clearly the housing has been, there's an artificial shortage going on, created by overregulation at different levels of governments and different veto points and environmentalists, etc. But there's nothing inherent which should prevent us from building more housing once the political atmosphere changes, like if young people, for example, decide to vote and protect their interests.
As I mentioned, Human Progress likes to tell a good story, and we can show our viewers some of those graphs now, from economic trends to violence trends to social trends. So much is going in the right direction. Is there anything in the data right now, anywhere in the world, that you've spotted where you think, gosh, that's actually not going in the right direction, or that's not moving fast enough?
Sure, and part of it has to do with the government's response to the COVID pandemic and the policies that we have pursued since then. I will speak about the United States, which is the country that I know best. Our incomes per capita, adjusted for inflation, are still lower than what they were back in 2020. And that's because, like Britain, we have shut down large sections of our economy. We went into a lockdown. And then on top of everything else, we had a bout of inflation. So our incomes are still lower. On top of that, in the United States, we have a problem with decreasing life expectancy. This is something which has happened in the United States before. I think there was one period when 2 years in succession, life expectancy was falling. But in the United States right now, I think for 3 years, consecutive years, we've had a fall in life expectancy. Now, part of it was driven by COVID, but part of it is also driven by the opioid epidemic.
Oh, wow.
So that's obviously very regrettable.
Certainly. I think it's understood here in the UK that is a serious crisis in America, but a lot of that gets lumped into the war on drugs. Can you talk a little bit more about the opioid crisis and just how disastrous it is in the US right now?
Well, I'm not a specialist in this area by any means, but we did have a problem with painkillers, which some people believe are being too liberally prescribed, and then we had a problem with people basically dying as a result of overconsumption. The other side of the argument is, of course, that painkillers do play a role in killing pain, and that there are a lot of patients right now who are suffering needlessly because lack thereof. Nonetheless, when we isolate the data, we can say that there is a problem in the United States because opioid deaths are not happening in other parts of the advanced Western world. So we have a problem there. On top of that, we have the problem with fentanyl, which is a brand new problem. And I don't think that we have a handle on how to deal with it, given how porous the border is in the South and how much of fentanyl is actually coming to the United States from Mexico.
back to the crux of your book, Superabundance. We've just had a global AI summit here in the UK, hosted by Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, attended by Elon Musk and other world leaders. And I'm curious about your perspective on AI and how it relates to your thesis around the superabundance, because I might imagine that you're quite optimistic and hopeful about AI, that it will be able to create all kinds of prosperity in the ways that you're talking about, where we become more efficient and more effective and actually use fewer resources. At least that's the positive spin on it.
The possibility is there, but we always have to be aware that any technology can be used for good and evil. And that is true of AI, as it is true of nuclear power.
Mm-hmm.
Nuclear is a perfect example of a technology which can provide the world with CO2-free energy, but can also be used in nuclear weapons. But it is also true of a common knife, which can be used in order to provide dinner or kill someone. So any technology can be used for good and evil, and I think AI must be seen like that. It has the potential of revolutionizing the entire economy. Only yesterday I was reading a story about how good AI is at detecting cancers, much more so than a human being. So there are all these potential benefits in the future, as well as potential dangers. I don't know, but I don't think that anybody knows how this is going to play out. My tendency is to be on the optimistic side of things, partly because human beings have a psychological quirk whereby they are afraid of losses much more than they are looking forward or being appreciative of potential gains. So we have this negativity bias whereby any new technology, we always think about, oh my God, what can go wrong? As opposed to, how can this improve the world? A perfect example of that would be mechanization of agriculture. How many people were worried that the rise of the tractor and other forms of mechanized agriculture would displace all of these workers. And you know what happened? It did. In 1900, 40% of American laborers worked in the agricultural sector. Today, it's 1.5%. Are all those workers unemployed? Of course not. They're just doing other things, working in other jobs that didn't exist when agriculture was dominant. So I think that we've always been very negative, very, very worried about new technology. This new technology has a potential to revolutionize the world, but there is a non-zero chance that it might not work out.
Non-zero, yeah. And what that non-zero looks like is varying degrees of difficulty for us to handle, I suppose. Are you familiar with the concept of fully automated luxury communism?
No.
Okay.
You have to explain that to me.
It's an idea that I became familiar with years back when a left-wing commentator, Aaron Bastani, made it the title of his book. The idea might have been bouncing around before that, I'm not sure, but fully automated luxury communism is quite a pure Marxist idea that you use capitalism to create this superabundance, but particularly you do it through AI, you do it through tech, and taking that to the brink and creating as much wealth and prosperity as you can. Now, I'm curious, I suspect that you and Aaron Bastani would come to different conclusions, but how different is your thesis of the superabundance really from this idea of fully automated luxury communism? Just trying to embrace the merits of capitalism, using technology to do that, and then drifting off into a utopia.
What a fabulous question. I mean, I'm really... excellent question. Let me think about that. So... my main problem with communism, obviously, well, let's put aside the human rights abuses, but it's the central planning, right? I wouldn't want any kind of central planning, and I wouldn't want, and I don't think that even AI could play a role equivalent to central planning, because we are still dealing with unpredictable human beings. So whether I'm going to buy a cup of coffee today, a croissant, or whether I'm going to buy 2 cups of coffee and no croissant tomorrow, that still very much depends on how I feel, what I want. AI cannot see that. AI cannot predict how human beings will interact in the marketplace. What sort of
in the same way governments can't
in,
predict.
but that's where I'm heading. Is that is why central planning failed, because no government had enough knowledge. We are now talking about the hierarchy and knowledge problem. No government ever had the kind of insight to know whether what people wanted next year was short skirts or short-sleeved shirts or long-sleeved shirts. Just didn't know, right? You couldn't predict. It is not clear to me how AI could ever predict the future in that kind of way, and therefore centrally plan the economy to produce for this Marxist utopia, as opposed to the market mechanism and the price mechanism that we are aware of today, right? That being said, again, the reason why your question is so wonderful is because I can see, even as a deep anti-communist, the interesting intersections. Marxists were very keen on technology. Mm-hmm. Very few people remember that the original Marxists, and even all the way up to the Soviet Union, Marxists were very keen on technology, and so am I. I guess the difference between me and Marxists, aside from the fact that I will do everything in my life to oppose them, would be that I still believe that the free market and freedom to distribute the benefits of a free economy, as opposed to the Marxists who would like to probably central plan everything.
Well, I think we just figured out where Superabundance, the Spectator, and Marxism overlap, which was a very nice note to end on. Marian, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.